You know, I don't know about you, but sometimes things just go wrong. They do. I mean, you forget to pay a bill, you forget to do this or that, you might put diesel in your gas tank, I don't know what it is, and things just start to pile up over and over, and it just kind of feels hopeless. And you wonder, is there any time you might just get a little break, But then I think about Jesus, and I wonder, like Jesus, could we maybe somehow manage to find some good in the troubles that often come our way? I believe, again, that we see that Jesus did, as we've been looking at having a heart like Jesus. And that's because when we think about Jesus' heart, Jesus had a hope-filled heart. He did. Think about it. When everybody else looked at Jesus from the outside and they thought about the things that he went through, they kind of thought that, hey, this is terrible. And whenever problems arose, whenever there was calamity or difficulty, Jesus seemed to find an opportunity. And it didn't matter if it was the man born blind in John chapter 9 or the disciples being caught up in a storm on the Sea of Galilee in Luke chapter 8. Jesus saw what others didn't. He found what others missed. Take a look over at Matthew chapter 6 and verses 22 and 23, where Jesus tells us that how we look at life determines how we live our life. There, Jesus tells us that the lamp of the body is the eye. Okay, the lamp of the body is the eye, how you perceive things, right? If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? In other words, how we view things that come our way in life, our perspective influences really our entire way of life. And when we look at Jesus, Jesus did much more than just talk about this principle. Jesus really see it applied in his life. And the main example that we want to look at today, and as our main text today, is over in Matthew chapter 26. And for those who might be new today, or you've been away for a while, or who knows, don't forget there's a copy of the sermon notes in back that you could doodle on while I go off on some tangent and you want to draw pictures of flowers. I don't know. But there's a copy of the sermon notes in the back for you to look at for these references. But over in Matthew chapter 26, kind of on the same vein that Larry was going down in the Lord's Supper, this is the night before Jesus' death, okay? And on that night, depending upon, again, your perspective of things seem completely hopeless for Jesus. And it was there in the time between Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane and the mock trial that sent him to the cross, that contained one of the darkest scenes in the history of human drama. Yet all of what happens here probably couldn't have taken more than, 5, 15 minutes, something like that. But in what happened, there was enough to make even the most optimistic person feel like it was hopeless. Now, as we read our text, we're going to see that not a single soul did anything good except for Jesus. And that's important for us to see because Jesus was the one facing what appeared, by the casual observer, a really hopeless situation. Still, Jesus saw reason to hope. And it's in Jesus' outlook that we can find an example to follow so that we too can have a hope-filled heart, just like Jesus. Okay, so let's go ahead and read our main text, and this is going to be from Matthew chapter 26 and verses 46 down through verse 56. So there in the text, Jesus announces, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given them a sign saying, whomever I kiss, he's the one, seize him. Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. But Jesus said to him, friend, why have you come? Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. But Jesus said to him, put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus? In that hour, Jesus said to the multitudes, have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to take me as against a robber? I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. And I look at that, and you often see these comparisons online, these images. You think you've had a bad day? You think you've had a bad day? Read this. Okay. The darkest night in Jesus' life was marked by one crisis after another, after another, after another. And now before we take a look at how Jesus saw all of this, let's go ahead and take a look at what that casual observer possibly saw. So what did they see? Well, first, a casual observer would have witnessed unanswered prayer. Okay, hear me when I say that. Because think about what we know about the context of what just happened here. Jesus had just offered an anguished appeal to God the Father. If we take a look back, if you're still there in Matthew, if you take a look back at verse 39 in chapter 26, where Jesus prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as my will, not as I will, but as you will. And this wasn't some calm tea and cookies type of prayer, Matthew 26:37 tells us that Jesus began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. In other words, Jesus fell down to the ground and cried out to God in prayer here. And if we look at Luke's account over in Luke 22:44, that's where Luke tells us that Jesus, being in agony, prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when you look at the scriptures, never on earth has anyone offered such an urgent request, and never has heaven just offered a more deafening silence. I mean, you don't see anything in the scriptures that gives the casual observer immediately right there that God heard his prayer and said yes. Think about that. People with problems today, what do they pray and they pray and they pray, and they think that God didn't answer their prayer, just like here. They think that, hey, well, there is no God since he didn't say yes to my prayer. Well, just because God didn't say yes to your prayer doesn't mean that you didn't get an answer to your prayer. So to the casual observer, Jesus had to deal with the dilemma of unanswered prayer. And again, just to clarify things, we know that it wasn't that his prayer wasn't answered, but that it was answered in a way that a part of Jesus didn't want it to be answered. That part that prayed that prayer, right? Because the answer that God the Father gave Jesus the Son was no. All right, second, a casual observer would have witnessed unappreciated service. I think we know what that's like. You do all sorts of good things and people have nothing but bad to say about you, or they just goes unobserved, right? Back in Matthew chapter 26, again, in verses 27 and verse 50, we're told that while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12 arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Then we're told that the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. And again, you have to think about all that there, right? The very people that Jesus had been ministering to, had been serving, that he had come to save, now had come to arrest him. And for what? Doing good? For healing somebody? And it just wasn't one or two people. Matthew tells us it was a large crowd. It was a great multitude. There was a whole lot of people there. And if we look at it from John's point of view, over in John chapter 18 and verse 3, we read that there was a detachment of soldiers, or your translation might say troops, or a band of men, and officers, or the Roman cohort and officers. They came to get Jesus. And the Greek word there could really mean all that stuff, but it's a Roman military term for a tenth part of a legion, normally containing 600 troops. I mean, come on. Now, we don't really know how many people there were there, but if there were 600 troops to get a man who was praying there in the garden, I'm thinking that's a little overkill, So no matter the number, we do know that there's more than a handful of men coming to take Jesus. But again, no matter the number, we would like to think that if all of those people there would be just one person who would defend Jesus. Because if you think about it, Jesus helped so many people. But no one stood up and said, hey, no, Jesus is a good guy. He worked with countless, right? And he comforted them, and he loved them, and he forgave them. He healed the sick. Probably there were people there that had friends or family or who were healed by Jesus. And then, or maybe they were lame or blind, or maybe those people who died that Jesus resurrected. And let's not forget about all the great things that Jesus said, the words of encouragement and blessings. But now there's this mob of angry people ready to arrest Jesus, and for what? Doing good, helping people. But of course, there was one person who did step forward to defend Jesus, right? Good old go-getter Peter, along with his wild swinging sword. Fortunately for Malchus, that's the servant of the high priest, Peter was a better fisherman than a swordsman. But you think about Jesus didn't say, good job, Peter. Instead of that, Peter was rebuked by Jesus and healed Malchus's ear. And so again, to the casual observer, Jesus was left alone and rejected by everyone, including God. So they kind of pitied Jesus maybe a little, probably with words like, oh, isn't that sad? He thought he was the Son of God and all this and blah, blah, blah. But we know again that just what Jesus said, he could have called 12 legions of angels. And we know that the Father was there because he's always there. He was watching. He was present. Just like when we go through times of trial and struggle and we think we're alone, we're not. God is there. All right, the third thing that a casual observer would have witnessed would have been the most bitter pill of all, in my opinion, the unbelievable betrayal of one of the 12. It isn't just a casual disciple who heard Jesus pray on the Sermon on the Mount, but one of the 12. I mean, think about Judas. Judas wasn't the only one who changed colors and ran off. We always point out Judas, but remember there in verse 56, we're told that all the disciples forsook him and fled. They all ran off. Think about that. For around 3.5 years, Jesus had grown incredibly close to the 12. They praised God together. They worked miracles together. They prayed together. They ate together. They traveled together, and on and on. How much more close could you get to someone, really? But all the disciples deserted him and fled. Even Peter. Because if you think about Peter again, only a few hours before that, Peter declared, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Matthew 26:33. And then down in verse 35, he said, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And I could see Jesus standing there keeping a straight face, and I really do wish that were the case, Jesus would say in his mind. But he already told them that the rooster was going to crow and that he was going to deny him. They all had pledged their loyalty to Jesus, and yet they all ran off, And we were sometimes hard on them when we see that in the text, but I think about our own loyalty and commitment that we made to Christ. And if we're ever faced with a challenge of our faith, do we defend our Lord and Savior, or do we humbly run off in our minds with less words and less example? But I think we know what it's like to have friends desert us. I mean, I think if you've lived long enough, you've had a close friend, supposed friend, maybe even family member who has left you in the lurch. Maybe they deserted you. Maybe they said bad things about you, something to that effect. They deserted us in our time of need, And again, from the casual observer's point of view, from the outside looking in, all anyone ever sees really in the case of Jesus and what just happened is hopelessness. They see a betrayal. The disciples ran off on him. The people rejected him. And also God said no to his prayer. That's what the casual observer sees. And so from a humanist point of view, Jesus' world had just collapsed into a big piling heap of mess. And if that's how the casual observer saw it, that's apparently not how Jesus saw it. Jesus saw something totally different. Now, that's not to say that Jesus wasn't oblivious to his problems and everything that's going on around him. He just wasn't limited by them. And we could be limited so much sometimes when bad things happen, when we feel it's hopeless. But Jesus somehow was able to see the good and the bad. He was able to see the purpose and the pain, if you will. He was able to detect and know that God's presence was there in his problems. So how can we have a hope-filled heart like Jesus? Well, we can do it by starting off by seeing like Jesus sees. And so how do you do that again? How can you see the good and bad like Jesus? Well, it's pretty hard to find someone worse than Judas in our example so far, I think, in our text in Matthew 26. Over in John 12:6, the Bible tells us that Judas was a thief, and he often, gleaned from the money bag, right? He was just helped himself, all right? On top of that, we see that Judas was the betrayer. He sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And that night when Judas led a mob to Jesus, he stood only inches away from Jesus' face and said to him, he gave him a kiss, a warm greeting of friendship. And Jesus there in verse 50 recognizes this, and he already knows what's going to happen. And he says, "Friend, do what you came to do." And I looked at all the translations. I looked up the Greek word, and friend means, companion, a friend person, okay? Someone who's your friend. And I think that's kind of confounding, knowing what Jesus knows. I don't know if it's hard to imagine. Jesus, you just called this man a friend. Hey, betrayer, good to see you. I see you brought your mob with clubs. Jesus called him a friend. Jesus doesn't lie. He wasn't saying it tongue-in-cheek or sarcastically, because somehow Jesus, in that moment, still saw something good in a very bad man. And that's probably because Jesus didn't actually place all the blame on Judas. We talked a little bit this morning at our Bible class again about people and the way they act and how they haven't come to Christ, but it's still a challenge, right? And I think Jesus saw that here again. Jesus saw another presence at work that night. Jesus said in Luke 22 and verse 53 that this is the time when darkness reigns. And who's the prince of darkness? Satan. Let's make it clear, Judas was in no way innocent here, but neither was he acting alone. Neither are those who attack and betray you and me they're not acting alone either. The Apostle Paul said it this way over in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. He tells us that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. It's a spiritual battle. And that spiritual armor, the armor of God, is still needed today. Think about it. Those who betray us and attack us are also victims of a sinful world that they're under the influence of. They're under the influence of Satan. So even though they're doing bad, we should remember that Satan is really the one behind it all. I mean, if Jesus was able to find a little bit of good in the face of Judas to be able to call him friend, then Jesus could help us to do the same with those who hurt us. Second, Jesus saw purpose in the pain there. Now, out of everything that Jesus said when he was arrested, the most important thing that he said had to do with the purposes of God in our text. Take a look again at what Jesus said in Matthew 26 and verse 56. Jesus said, "But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." In other words, Jesus chose to see this mess. Jesus chose to see his immediate struggle as a necessary part of God's greater plan. He made that choice. And so even though things were bad for Jesus, Jesus knew that the Father was with him. Jesus knew that, this was fulfilling God's plan. Jesus knew that this had to happen in order for something good to come about. So again, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed by the casual observer, Jesus was able to see God. And that's because Jesus wasn't blinded by his surroundings. He wasn't limited in his sight. He was able to see the hand of God in things that were happening. And now here's where the proverbial rubber meets the road, right? How can we have a hope-filled heart like Jesus? How can we do like what Jesus did? How can we see the will of God in the midst of chaos when things seem hopeless? Is it even possible to see the purposes of God in our suffering and pain, or the goodness of God in the problems that we're facing? And right about now, you could say, well, Chuck, Jesus was the Son of God. He was actually God in the flesh, and he knows what's going to happen. So, come on, okay? If we said that about everything that Jesus did, how could we ever hope to walk and live like Jesus? All right. So granted, maybe you and I can't see the way Jesus saw right then and there. But let's not forget that we are made in the spiritual image of God, Genesis 1:27. So that means that we have the potential to see God in the challenges that come our way. We have that potential. The thing is, we're usually so focused on all the problems all at once that we can't begin to see anything but hopelessness. And so to us, no matter how much we pray, there's still going to be some kind of a problem that we have to deal with. But remember, God never promises to remove us from our struggles, but God does promise us that we will be able to change and to grow and mature from them. Over in Romans chapter 8, the Apostle Paul lists all kinds of things that he went through. And if you look at that list, it seems hopeless, Things like trouble and hardship and persecution and famine and nakedness and sword and even death. And I think, hey, if something is kind of hopeless, death, well, that seems pretty hopeless to the casual observer again. And we don't often like to think about those things because they're terrible things, right? They all seem so hard and hopeless to us. But God tells us that these things that we sometimes go through do have value in verse 37. There we're told that in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Now that word "in" is kind of an interesting preposition, right? Because it'd be great if we weren't in all of those things and going through all of them. All right. But we are in them, and we're told that we are conquerors in those things. Not because of anything that I've done, but again, because of him who loved us, because of Christ. The key in having a hope-filled heart like Jesus is not necessarily trying to avoid or remove life's challenges and difficulties, but to change the way we see them, to be able to find God in them. And that's a challenge, especially when something bad happens, right? And sometimes it's just a matter of refocusing our eyes to focus not on the problems themselves right then and there, but on the big picture. Again, we often do that in hindsight, but Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2 tells us that we need to look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The key is, again, to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. Again, that's a challenge. I'm not saying this is easy. So even though Jesus was rejected and incarcerated and tortured and murdered, he was still able to see joy, the joy that was set before him. And that is amazing, isn't it? He saw the joy, what? In all those bad things? No, he didn't see the joy in being crucified on the cross. Oh, this is fun. No, okay? But he saw the joy it would bring you and me, okay? The joy that it would bring to the Father, the glory it would bring to God. He would see the joy that we would experience and the salvation that we would have. Jesus had the ability, though, to see God in everything. Jesus had the right perspective. And when it comes to you and me, it's a challenge again. That's why there's so much in the scriptures, like over in James chapter 1 and verses 2 through 4, to count it all joy. We're to count it all joy, it says, when we fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Again, that's not to say, hey, boy, I'm really happy that I just got in a car accident and, I don't have a car anymore or something. That's not the point. The point is to keep focused on God and understand that you're never alone, that things are going to happen, and that the key to having a hope-filled heart, no matter the situation, is to stay focused on God. All right, and the promises of God, because God's purpose for our lives is always greater than the problems in our lives. Remembering again that the time that we spend here is teeny tiny. It's small compared to eternity. Again, no one is saying that any of this is easy. Jesus didn't have an easy time of it. Look back in Matthew 26. But it should be our prayer that God will help us to find him in the challenges that we face so that we could have a hope-filled heart. I have one more passage to read, and it's connected to our scripture reading this morning. This is over in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 3 through 9. I'm just going to read the text. Peter writes, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls." Just a little blip again, right? Now, in that passage, again, God tells us that all kinds of trials will most likely come our way. But that's so that our faith may be proved genuine and again result in the praise, glory, and honor of God. Again, now I know that everyone is going through things at different stages of life. Sometimes it's really bad. Sometimes nothing's going on. Sometimes it's, just kind of bad. It could involve finances, your health, your relationships, the loss of loved ones. God only knows, right? But again, we can have a hope-filled heart like Jesus with God's help by trusting in his word and his promises. Again, in 1 Peter there, in verses 3 and 4, we're reminded that we hope again because of Jesus' resurrection, because of what he did on the cross and being raised to life again, right? We can have the hope of heaven because of that resurrection, a hope that we can be assured of because of what Jesus did for you and me on the cross of Calvary. And so today, if there's anyone here without hope, then like 1 Peter 1:3 tells us, we can have hope through our new birth by being born again in our baptism into Christ. Romans 6 verses 3 and 4 reminds us that, don't you know that as many of us were baptized into Christ, were baptized into his death. Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into his death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of God the Father, even so we too may walk in newness of life. And so if there's anyone here today who needs to come forward during the invitation song, maybe it's to become a Christian for the first time, or possibly you have a prayer request that we could help out with, or there's some other need that as a loving church family, we could be a blessing to you. I want to encourage you to come forward as together we do stand and sing the song that was selected.